When the laws of the world fail, the shadows take over to settle the final score for those who were wronged. Witness the cold and calculated path of people who refuse to let betrayal go unpunished. Hit subscribe now and watch how justice is truly served in the dark.
He called me dead weight in front of 43 people. I counted them later. 43 colleagues, some of whom I'd trained myself, all watching while my boss's son pointed at me across the conference table and said, "This company needs to move fast, and some people just can't keep up." He didn't even use my name, just gestured at me like I was a piece of furniture he'd decided to replace. I slid my laptop across the table, set my badge on top of it, stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out. I didn't say a word. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, was that I was the only person alive who understood how the whole machine actually ran. My name is Gordon. I'm 51 years old. I spent 19 years building something that wasn't mine, and I did it because I believed in the work, not in the man who owned it. In the work itself. Kellner & Sons was a regional food distribution company, started by a man named Howard in the mid-80s out of a warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. By the time I came on board in 2005, they had 3 distribution centers, contracts with about 40 regional grocery chains, and a reputation for being the kind of company that showed up when others didn't. Floods, ice storms, supply chain disruptions, Kellner & Sons delivered. That wasn't an accident. That was planning. And for most of those 19 years, I was the one doing the planning. My title was Operations Director. But the title didn't capture it. I was the person who knew which supplier in rural Kentucky would move fast if we needed a substitute protein at 48 hours notice. I knew which refrigeration technician in Cleveland would answer his phone at 2 in the morning during a heat wave. I had built a compliance documentation system from scratch because the one they had when I arrived was held together with spreadsheets and optimism. I knew where every contract was, what every penalty clause said, what every renewal deadline looked like on a calendar. Howard understood what I was. He'd say, "Gordon, you're the connective tissue." He meant it as a compliment. He was right. I also, quietly, over the years, documented everything, not out of paranoia, out of habit, out of the same instinct that made me a good operations director. You account for what exists before you can plan what comes next. I had binders. I had shared drives. I had succession notes that I'd sent to Howard at least 4 times requesting that we hire someone junior to shadow me, cross-train, build redundancy into the system. He always agreed in principle. We never got around to it. That was on both of us. I understand that now. Howard's son was named Trevor. Trevor was 29. He had an MBA from a school I'd heard of and a LinkedIn profile that used the word disruptive 4 times in the summary section. He'd spent 2 years at a consulting firm doing what consultants do, telling companies what's wrong with them without ever having to fix anything themselves. Then Howard had a mild cardiac event in the fall of last year. Nothing too serious, but enough to make him think about succession. Enough to hand Trevor the keys. I met with Trevor twice before everything happened. The first time, he came through the operations center in Columbus with a notepad and what I can only describe as the energy of a man who has already made up his mind. He wasn't there to learn. He was there to catalog what he was going to change. He asked me to explain our routing system. I walked him through it. The software we used, the manual overrides, the relationships with regional carriers that the software couldn't account for because they were built on phone calls and handshakes over the past decade. He nodded like he was listening. He was not listening. The second meeting was in his office. He had printed out some kind of organizational efficiency report. He slid it across the desk to me and pointed at a section I'll paraphrase as redundant middle management roles carrying overhead without clear KPI accountability. He was pointing at me. I said, "Trevor, that report doesn't account for institutional knowledge." He said, "Gordon, every system should be replaceable. That's what scalability means." I told him I'd sent his father 4 memos over the past 6 years requesting that we build exactly that kind of redundancy. I could forward them to him if he'd like. He said, "I appreciate the history lesson." That was the last real conversation we had. 3 weeks later, he called an all-hands meeting. I want you to understand what kind of man Trevor was, because it matters for what happened next. Trevor was not cruel exactly. He was worse than cruel. He was performative. He had read somewhere that decisive leadership requires visible action, that you signal strength by making hard choices publicly and without hesitation. He had learned management the way someone learns a language from a textbook. He knew all the vocabulary, none of the rhythm. He stood at the front of the room and talked for about 12 minutes about transformation, about velocity, about being willing to ask hard questions about legacy structures. I sat in the third row and watched 42 other people try to figure out where this was going. Then he said, "Trimming dead weight isn't personal, it's necessary." He looked at me. "Gordon, we're going to be moving in a different direction. Today's your last day." Just like that. No prior conversation, no HR, no severance discussion. Just 42 witnesses and a man who thought he was being decisive. I sat there for exactly 3 seconds. I thought about saying something. There was a lot I could have said. Instead, I reached into my pocket, set my badge on the table. I had my personal laptop in my bag. I'd stopped using the company machine for anything sensitive months ago, honestly, just out of professional habit. I stood up. I nodded at a couple of colleagues I'd worked with for over a decade. I walked out. Trevor didn't follow me, didn't send anyone after me, didn't call. I don't think it occurred to him that there was anything else to do. That afternoon I drove home, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table for about an hour just being quiet. I wasn't devastated exactly. I'd seen it coming in the way you see weather. You can feel the pressure change before the rain starts. What I felt was something more like clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for anything except myself. Then I started thinking about the quarterly carrier audit that was due in 11 days. Not my problem anymore, technically. I thought about the refrigeration maintenance contracts at the Cincinnati facility, 3 of which were up for renewal within the month, and which required sign-off from someone with authority I no longer had. Also not my problem. I thought about the routing software that ran on a server I had personally configured and maintained because we'd never gotten around to migrating it, and the admin credentials for which existed in exactly one place. A system I had built and that was tied to my professional accounts. Starting to see it now. I thought about the EDI compliance documentation for our 2 largest grocery chain clients, both of whom had audit windows opening in about 6 weeks. That documentation lived in a folder structure I had organized, and that no one else had ever needed to fully understand, because I had always been the one who handled it. I finished my coffee. I thought about calling Howard. I almost did, but Howard was in Florida recovering, and his doctors had told the family to keep his stress levels down, and besides, Trevor had made a decision. That was his right. He was the one who'd stood in front of 43 people and made it definitively clear who was in charge. I decided I'd let him be in charge. The call started on day 4. The first one was from a woman in logistics named Beverly. She was one of the good ones. Sharp, careful, the kind of person who double-checked everything. She called my personal cell and said, "Gordon, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're gone, but no one can get into the routing dashboard. Trevor said he'd handle credentials, but he hasn't, and we've got 6 trucks that haven't been dispatched." I said, "Beverly, I don't work there anymore. You need to go through Trevor." She said, "I know, I didn't know who else to call." I said I was sorry I couldn't help and I wished her luck. The second call came from our IT vendor on day 6. They were doing a scheduled maintenance update and needed authorization from someone with admin rights. I had been that someone. They didn't have anyone else on file. I told them to reach out to the company's current management. They said they had. No one had responded. I said I was sorry and I hung up. By day 8, from what I was hearing through the grapevine, and small industries have vigorous grapevines, Kellner and Sons was having what you might call a cascading operational event. 3 routes in the Southern Ohio territory had been misassigned because someone had tried to manually override the routing system without understanding the logic and had managed to double book 2 trucks to the same warehouse while leaving a 3rd warehouse unserved for an entire day. One of their grocery chain clients had called to complain, then to threaten. On day 9, I got a call from a man named Arthur. Arthur was the company's outside legal counsel, had been for many years, and was also a personal friend of Howard's. He was calm on the phone, professional, but I could hear something underneath it. He said, "Gordon, I want you to know I'm calling in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the company." I said, "I understand." He said, "I want to ask you something directly. Is there anything that should have been formally transitioned to someone else when you left that wasn't?" I said, Arthur, I sent Howard 4 separate memos over 6 years requesting that we build a succession and cross-training structure for my role. I never received authorization to do so. When I was let go, I returned the company laptop, the company badge, and any company property in my possession. I retained nothing that belongs to them. Silence on the line. Then he said, the routing system. I said, the routing system runs on infrastructure that was configured under my professional accounts because we never completed the migration to a standalone server that I also requested in writing twice. That's a company infrastructure issue, not a personal one, he said. Is there any possibility you'd be willing to consult? I said, Arthur, Trevor made it very clear in front of the entire company that he needed to move in a different direction. I respect that. I'd hate to confuse the direction. He thanked me and hung up. On day 11, the quarterly carrier audit that I had mentioned to no one missed its filing window. That had consequences I won't pretend I didn't know about. Their 2 largest carrier contracts had performance reporting requirements. Missing a window didn't void the contracts, but it triggered a review period, and during a review period, you're essentially operating on probation. Any service failures during that window get flagged. They were already having service failures. On day 14, one of the grocery chain clients formally notified Keller & Sons that they were conducting an audit of EDI compliance documentation going back 18 months. I know exactly what that documentation looked like. I had built it. It was thorough, accurate, and organized in a way that was completely intuitive to me and borderline incomprehensible to anyone else, because I had never needed it to be comprehensible to anyone else. I had been spending my time quietly. I went on some long walks. I called my daughter in Seattle. I read 3 books I'd been meaning to read for years. I met twice with an employment attorney. Yes, I explored that option. She told me I had a reasonable case for wrongful termination given the manner of it. I thought about it seriously. Then I decided against it. Not because I didn't have a case, but because I didn't want to spend the next year of my life in that particular room. I wanted to move forward. I had also, in those first 2 weeks, taken 3 calls from former colleagues at other companies. My reputation in the regional distribution industry was solid. People knew my name. 2 of those calls were exploratory. The third was from a direct competitor of Keller & Sons, a company called Hartfield Regional, whose operations VP had heard I was available and wanted to have lunch. We had lunch on day 17. I'll be honest with you. It was a good lunch. On day 21, Trevor called me himself. I didn't recognize the number at first. When he identified himself, I took a breath and I let him talk. He talked for about 4 minutes. It was a different Trevor than the one who had pointed at me across a conference table. This one was quieter, careful with his words in a way he hadn't been before, like a man walking on ice he'd already heard crack once. He said the company was experiencing some operational difficulties. He said he recognized that the transition had been abrupt. He said he wanted to discuss the possibility of a consulting arrangement. I asked him what he had in mind. He said he was prepared to be flexible. I said, Trevor, I want to be straightforward with you. I've recently entered into a consulting relationship with another organization in this industry. I have obligations to them that I take seriously, and I won't do anything that creates a conflict. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is it Hartfield? I said, I'm not at liberty to discuss that. Which meant yes. He knew it meant yes. He said, Gordon, I made a mistake. I want to tell you that was satisfying in some dramatic way. It wasn't, really. It was just true. A man on the phone admitting something true. There wasn't any triumph in it, just the mild, quiet weight of being right about something you'd never wanted to be right about. I said, Trevor, I have a lot of respect for your father and for what he built. I hope the company finds its footing. I genuinely mean that. He said, Is there anything? I said, I'm sorry, I have to go. And I hung up. I heard later through Arthur, who remained a friend through all of this in his careful arm's-length way, that Keller & Sons brought in an outside operations consultant at a significant daily rate to help stabilize things. It took about 4 months. They lost the smaller of the 2 grocery chain clients during that period. The carrier contracts survived the review period, but just barely. They eventually hired a new operations director, someone competent from what I understand, and they've been rebuilding slowly. Howard came back from Florida in the spring. He didn't call me, and I didn't call him. I understood that. There are things between fathers and sons that other people can't enter into, and Howard's loyalty, in the end, was where it should be. I didn't hold it against him. Trevor did not call again. I started at Hartfield Regional as Senior VP of Operations 4 months after being called dead weight in front of 43 people. It was a different title, more money, fewer ghosts. On my first day, I sat down with their executive team and I said, the first thing I want to do is document everything I know, create proper handover systems, and cross-train 2 people to understand every function I'm responsible for. Their CEO looked at me and said, that's unusual. Most people want to make themselves indispensable. I said, I know. I've seen how that ends. There's something I want to say directly, because I've thought about it a lot since all of this happened. I didn't set out to hurt Kellner and Sons. I didn't walk out of that room with a plan. I wasn't sitting at home those first few weeks thinking about the audit window or the routing credentials or the EDI folders and rubbing my hands together. That's not who I am, and that's not what happened. What happened was simpler and maybe harder to accept. I had spent 19 years being the person who held things together, and when I left, things didn't hold together. That's not revenge. That's just physics. The lesson, if there is one, and I'm not sure institutions are capable of learning lessons the way people are, is that you cannot build a system that depends entirely on one person and then be surprised when that person leaves. Whether they leave because they want to, because they retire, because they get sick, because they get fired in front of 43 colleagues while being called dead weight, it doesn't matter. The fragility was always there. Trevor didn't create it. Neither did I. Howard created it slowly over many years by needing me to be indispensable because it was easier than building something more resilient, and I let it happen because it felt good to be needed. That's the honest version. I made myself the master connection. And then someone cut it. The difference between me and the version of this story that ends badly is that I had spent 19 years quietly preparing for every contingency except the one where I was no longer the person responsible for handling them. So when the cut came, I landed on my feet, not because I'd planned it, because I'd lived it. My daughter called me a couple of weeks into the new job. She asked me how I was doing. I told her I was good, genuinely good, not the kind of good you say to end a conversation. She said, Dad, are you satisfied with how everything went? Like, do you feel like justice happened? I thought about it. I said, I feel like reality happened. And sometimes that's enough. She laughed. She said that sounded like something I'd cross-stitch and put on a wall. I said maybe I would. I haven't, but I think about it sometimes, on the mornings when I drive past the Kellner and Sons regional office on my way into Hartfield, which I do because geography is indifferent to irony, and I see the lights on and the trucks in the lot and I think, they're still there, still running, a little smaller, a little more careful, and I'm still here too. Running something different, built, this time, to last without me. That's not revenge, that's just how it works. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not the surface version of it, not the clean story where the bad guy loses and the good guy wins and everyone learns something neat. The real version is messier and, I think, more honest. Trevor didn't fail because he was a bad person. He failed because he had confused confidence with competence, and no one in his life had ever made those two things cost him anything before. That's not a moral failing in the dramatic sense. It's just a gap, the kind that opens slowly, quietly, and then one day you step into it and there's nothing underneath. What I've come to believe is that the choices we make about how we work, whether we build things carefully or carelessly, whether we document or cut corners, whether we prepare for the day we won't be there, those choices don't announce themselves as moral decisions. They feel like logistics, they feel like paperwork, but they accumulate into something that looks, eventually, a lot like character. I sent Howard 4 memos over 6 years. 4 times I said in writing that we needed to build redundancy, cross-train someone, create a system that could survive without me at the center of it. I did that not because I was planning to leave, but because I understood that depending entirely on one person is a fragile way to build anything. That's not wisdom I was born with. I learned it from watching other operations come apart. I learned it from paying attention. And when Trevor pointed at me across that table and called me dead weight, what I felt underneath the sting of it, underneath the embarrassment of 42 people watching, was something close to clarity. Because I had done the work. 19 years of it. Not perfectly, not without my own share of mistakes, but honestly. And no one can take that from you by pointing at you in a room. The hardest thing isn't being underestimated. The hardest thing is staying the same person when you are, not letting bitterness hollow you out, not letting the injustice of it become the story you tell about yourself forever. I could have made Trevor the villain of my life. I chose not to, not because he deserved generosity, but because I didn't want to live in a story where he was that important. When I walked into at Hartfield, the first thing I did was sit down and say, I'm going to make myself replaceable on purpose. I'm going to document everything I know and teach it to 2 other people. Because that's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not a gesture, not a speech, just the daily decision to build things that are bigger than your own need to be needed. The consequences Trevor faced weren't punishment. They were just the natural weight of decisions he'd made catching up with him. That's how it works, in my experience. Not dramatically, not with music playing. Just quietly, the way a structure settles when you remove something load-bearing. I think about Gordon sometimes, the version of me who walked out of that building. And I'm proud of him for staying quiet, for not making it a scene, for trusting that the work would speak for itself. It did. That's enough for me.